Welcome back to History Today. Last week, we looked at the Roman religion in its simplest iteration. But, after the Romans' magic failed to control nature, a new theology and methodology was necessary to ensure the natural order remained. And so today, we'll be looking at the developments that came about near the time of the legendary lawyer king called Numa. After the sense of magic and view that objects or living things were divine beings themselves, and the expansion of that idea into the nymph concept, the Romans began to view numen as semi-personified abstractions of powers, like health or good harvest, first words, first steps. The numen were not properly gods. That would only come after they received personal names, but they did have their own domains and faculties. These numen were somewhat the next stage in theological thought, and at each transition point we see holdovers in practice that did not fully make the theological jump to the next stage. The lapis manalis remained from the magical time, and Faunus's imps in the wild stayed a holdover from the animism time, them being particularly important as useful reminders of the natural malice of the nymphs that was generally perceived. Each stage of development of a Roman's life was seen as under the purview of a numen. From the first steps of a child to their first solid food. Farm life was likewise under the power of many numen, from sowing, rain, heat, ripening to harvest and storage. So here we see that the numen were vague in their concept, but specific in function. This later condenses into God's specific function and naming, where the numen theology is left over as a reminder in the epithets of Roman gods, like Lucina for childbirth, and this can even explain later on the genealogy of the gods in some parts, where epithets or powers or aspects of a god become separated from their parent and are seen as individual persons. These rocks and trees, nymphs and numen, were not people. They were either objects or abstracted powers. The Romans worshipped their gods without images. Those who introduced representations among the nations took away fear and brought in falsehood. This Varro said, explaining that for 170 years after the founding of Rome in 754 BC, the religion did not include human representation of the gods. There was some imagery that represented gods, or pointed to divine beings, like the silex or the rock of Jupiter or the spears of Mars, but they themselves were historically magical, and their assumption as objects of a god came after the fact. The spears of Mars were divine spears that then were later on viewed as a part of the armory of Mars. The famous historic temples that we see today in Rome and the surrounding area were not to be found in the time of Numa. Since the gods were as yet to be conceived of as anthropomorphic beings, they had yet to have homes or temples. The earliest temple of this time that we do see in the Roman region was to Diana, and it was said to have been built by the Etruscans for their non-Roman goddess. Vesta's sacred fire in the Forum was a closed building erected for religious purposes, which we would generally say is a temple, but its status is controversial, since it was built for the very practical difficulty of maintaining a fire without overhead cover from rain. While the numen did not dwell inside of a temple or a particular edifice, they did have special connection to localities, like the hearth, the door, or the storehouse. The state religion mimicked the hearth and the door by having a state hearth and a state door, which was the pomerium, or the wall around the city of Rome. As I said, these gods were not thought of as people-like, but as powers, which were called numen. The numen did not have personal sentiment or affection showed to them by the Romans, but a uniquely practical, legal attitude was adopted in their approach to the relationship between the numen and the Roman people. King Numa of Rome, a great lawyer, set forward the jus sacrum, or sacred law, as the body of laws that regulated the contract between a man and a numen. As in a civil contract, the expectation was that each party would adhere to the obligations of the contract, where the answers to prayers must be met with a kind of thanksgiving offering. If prayers were not answered, then there were two potential causes. Either the human failed to make the contract through conscious or unconscious violation of the law, or the god had put itself outside of the legal framework, and a new god was to be sought after who might be more cooperative. It is this courtroom setting where parties choose to enter into contract or not that led to the willingness of Rome, when under duress and the appeals to the old powers had failed, to begin to look and incorporate foreign deities into their state cult. Cato's prayer from the previous video offered an alternative prayer if there were any trouble with the sacrifice of the pig, sheep, or ox. That either all three or only the problematic animal be sacrificed again until properly done. Pietas was the Roman conception of proper action in responsibility to appease the gods and maintain the agreements that an individual and their clan had made with the gods. It is not faith, but practical upholding one's side of a bargain. Men who went to the gods or numen with a particular intention, and it seemed to have been granted, would frequently inscribe into stone the saying, votum redidi lubens merito, or, I have paid my vow gladly, as it was due. This votive prayer would usually have a timeline attached, so that the man would know if he might need to look elsewhere. It very clearly pointed, again, to the legal mindset that prevailed around the topic of religion in Rome. Just as men might make an action as the start of a potential contract, the numen or gods were thought to send earthquakes or storms with the intention to gain a sacrifice or a benefit from the Roman people. This pax deum, or the peace of the gods, was the relationship between the state and the gods, and maintaining it was a main function of the Roman king and the Pontifex Maximus, particularly during the Roman Republic. The Roman religion was a religion of contracts and agreements, by which men and gods were bound to each other, and which violation of would cause great ire and change the dynamic of sacrifice and action. These were not friendships of love or affection or hope or faith, but of business partners engaged in for profit and only for hope of advantage by each party. In the next video, we'll be taking a look at some of the ceremonies of the Roman religion and the role of the Roman priestly class, both men and women. Thank you for watching. Please let me know if there's anything you'd like me to talk about in the next video, and I hope to see you again next week.